Welcome to everyone out there. This is December 23rd. It is our weekly Wednesday Arts Advocacy Update hosted by Texans for the Arts, the statewide arts advocacy organization. We're glad you're joining us today. We're going to have a very informative session on the recently congressionally passed COVID relief bill. I will promise you it's going to be fascinating, interesting, and it will go longer than our usual 15 minutes. So hold tight and join us for the ride. Texans for the Arts is a statewide arts advocacy organization. We are celebrating our 25th year, and our mission is to secure, protect, and grow the public investment in the arts and to support public policy that deepens the impact of the arts across our communities. We started this Wednesday series on Veterans Day. It's speaking with arts leaders who work with arts and veterans in the community. And since then, we've had sessions on the outcome of the election, getting ready for the 87th session, and our upcoming Texas Arts Advocacy Summit in January and February. And today, I want to introduce our guest, Nate McGaha. Nate is Executive Director of Arts North Carolina. He's been in that position since 2017, and he brings extensive advocacy experience to that job, and including helping pass legislation in North Carolina, a high school graduation requirement for arts education, which is huge, which we are fortunate to have here in Texas as well. Not an easy task, Nate. And before that, he has years of experience of working in the dance field and the ballet field. And before that, he has a degree from the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, where he received a BA in design and production with a concentration in lighting. And I will say the lighting continues to shine a spotlight on work. Nate is exemplary in his knowledge of breaking down complex legislation and making it digestible. So I'm going to turn over what is a very complex bill, 5,556 pages or something like that, the Congress just passed. And if you in the audience have questions, please put them in the comment box. We will try to get to them before the end of today. If not, we will follow up electronically and share the answers with everybody on Facebook. But let me turn it over to Nate to give us a whirlwind ride.
All right. Ann, thank you very much for that. For those of you that don't know, I work with Ann a lot with the State Arts Action Network, which is basically all the different leaders of the statewide arts advocacy organizations. She is the chair of that group, and honestly has been leading on a national level, and the situation for the arts would not be nearly as good without her leadership. So please make sure that you recognize and thank her for that. Like Ann said, I am Nate McGaha. And just a little bit about my speaking style, because we've got a whole lot of information in a very short amount of time. I am often told that listening to me talk is like drinking from a fire hose. So I promise that you are not going to leave thirsty for information, but you might get a little wet. We do have, I think, a link on the video post for this right now that'll take you to a video of a previous webinar I did earlier today, as well as the slides that I'm going to be using today, so that you can kind of go back and reference those slides, and you can also find that at artsnc.org. So that might kind of help to backtrack a little bit if you get the slides. Oops, hold on just one second. And I need to, let me just share the screen real quick. And starting from here. All right, great. So just to kick off, our federal arts priorities at Arts North Carolina look very much like what you were working for with Texans for the Arts, looking for COVID-19 relief for state and local government, because obviously that's going to fund arts councils, that's going to fund at the city, county, and state level. It's also going to cause a lot of other problems without that. Relief funding, we were looking for more of that through both the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, specifically for relief funding like we had with the $75 million in the CARES Act. We set these priorities back in June, so this is something we've all been working on for a really long time. Second round of payroll protection loans, obviously those were a huge help early on in the spring. A second round is desperately needed, has been desperately needed for a really long time, so that's been a major priority. Save Our Stage Act, we're going to talk a lot more about that later, but when we kicked this off, it was a $10 billion grant, and it was specifically for-profit and nonprofit live performance venues. So that was where it started off back in the middle of the summer. kind of making sure that we extended or, reanimated that $600 extra a week for federal pandemic unemployment compensation. That's that $600 a week that got added to everybody's unemployment. Mixed Earner Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Act. That's sort of that was a bill that was written to allow folks that earned regular wages as well as earned some of their income through like 1099 or self-employment work, that they would be able to get a fair unemployment amount. And then the $300 universal charitable deduction from the CARES Act, getting that either increased or expanded to reach into 2021. So as we move through the fall, you can see obviously the Democrats launched the HEROES Act 2.0 back in early October that checked a lot of these boxes. Those are all the blue stars. You can see they had a lot of funding as well as relief funding through the NEA, the state and local government funding. You see bipartisan agreement on the Payment Protection Program loans, as well as Republicans were floating ideas that increase that $300 to a $600 for individual and $1,200 for those filing jointly charitable deduction, and extending that. So, but of course, last week it's kind of been a firestorm of activity going on in DC, because they joined the relief package that we've been all working for, as well as the FY21 federal budget, and created one bill that, as you can see, checked a lot of the boxes. So obviously, relief for state, local, and tribal governments, that did not happen. That was a big sticking point for Republicans. We are hopeful that that's going to come about in the after January with a new Congress and a new president. We'll see how things work out depending on how the elections go in Georgia, which is a whole nother story. We did not get relief funding through the NEA, but this also was a budget bill. And in the budget for the NEA this year, they saw a $5.2 million increase, getting them up to $167.5 million. So that's fantastic growth. That's the biggest leap that we've had in quite some time, actually, at $5 million. That second round of payroll protection program loans, that completely is in the bill, and we're going to talk a little bit more about exactly how you can qualify for those. They're not for everybody, just for those that are struggling a little bit more than others. The Save Our Stages Act didn't come in at $10 billion. It came in at $15 billion, and that is billion with a B. And in the arts world, we're not used to dealing with numbers for our industry that talk about billions of dollars in federal funding. So we're going to dive into that. In addition to live performance venues, it was performing arts organizations, museums, talent agents. So that bill kind of got expanded before it made it, and we're going to dive into more detail there. Well, in addition to the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, we being reenacted, I guess. So but it's not going to be at $600 a week. It'll be at $300 a week. That's going to be December 26th through March 14th. So just for those 11 weeks in there, anybody collecting unemployment as a result of the pandemic is going to see an extra $300 a week on their benefit check. But we also got 11-week extensions of pandemic unemployment assistance and pandemic emergency unemployment compensation. I am going to dive a little bit more into that. It gets complicated. Luckily, it's not as complicated as for Texans as it is for North Carolinians. So some of my slides may confuse you a little bit. But we also saw some movement on the mixed earner compensation in a different program than what we were looking for, but that was a big move. And we saw movement for that $300 universal charitable deduction. It is now $300 for individual and $600 filing jointly. So that's an increase, and it also got extended through 2021. So that we were really happy to see that. A lot of nonprofit organizations across the country are working for that. So diving into federal unemployment assistance, PUA, as you might well know, is the program that that covers self-employed and independent contractors, the gig workers that are not, they don't typically pay into unemployment, so they're not typically eligible. This was set up so that originally in the first CARES Act, so they would have 39 weeks of unemployment covered really from when the pandemic hit in mid-March all the way through the end of this year, which, as you know, ends at the end of this week. This bill would expand it by an extra 11 weeks, which means that it's possible to get it for 50 weeks. That kind of expands it to March 14th, but if you didn't start getting your PUA until, say, April, then you would still be able to collect on that until, to collect up to 50 weeks up until April 4th. So on April 5th, that's a Monday, that week you cannot claim unemployment or on PUA. As I said, we got the $300 increase on the FPUC. So that's 11 weeks, December 26th through 14th. Any and all unemployment that you're getting as a result of COVID-19, whether or not it's state or federal, it's going to have $300 added on to that weekly benefit. So that's going to be very, very helpful. Pandemic and emergency unemployment compensation, which I like to call the PUC, is extended by 11 weeks. Similar to the PUA, it's added 11 weeks to it. So in Texas, your state has 26 weeks of benefits. In the CARES Act, the PEUC added 13 weeks to that, so it got it up to 39 weeks, right? So you can see that the 39 weeks there for Texas was the same as the 39 weeks of PUA that you had as well. So that got you to the end of the year, got 48 states to the end of the year, did not get North Carolina to the end of the year, but that is my problem, not yours. And so now we've added an extra 11 weeks. So that's going to take you till March 14th. But just like the PUA, if you have, if you didn't start until say April, and you still have weeks left of the 20, I guess it's 24 weeks now, in addition to the 26. So that gets you up to the 50 weeks. If you still have a few weeks of PEUC left, you can collect that up until the week starting on April 5th. Just touching a little bit on the mixed earner for wages. So if you are, say that you maybe work 35 hours a week for wages at Starbucks or whatever, or whatever job you have, marketing, whatever, and you get wages like the majority of Americans. But then you also are a saxophonist or a violinist or a mime, and you could not do your work because of the pandemic. As long as you earned, but that extra work, that work as a musician or an actor or whatever, that extra work was as a 1099 contract employee. As long as you made $5,000 of that self-employment work on your last taxes, you can get an extra $100 a week in accordance with this bill. So that's really only it's added to the FPUC, so it's for 11 weeks, but we're starting to see some recognition that not all earners either fall into a gig worker, self-employed, or a wage earner, that there's a lot of middle ground in between those two, or a lot of folks that are mixed up. I'm not going to get into extended benefits because that really only applies for, well, North Carolina, where we're all running out of our weeks. I will say this, though, the emergency unemployment relief for nonprofits, that was something in the CARES Act that said through the end of 2020, the federal, those nonprofits that were not insured, for which, you know, is an option for unemployment, do not have to carry unemployment insurance, that the federal government would, and they have to pay all of their unemployment expenses, the federal government would cover 50%. So that is going to continue through the end of this year. I know in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina picks up the other 50%. I don't know if that's true in Texas, and maybe Ann can fill in on that later. So that's what I know on unemployment. Diving into PPP, I will say don't run out before the end of the presentation and start thinking you're going to file for PPP, because there's some caveats to that with the Save Our Stages. But for a regular paycheck protection, it was reinstituted, so it's got more money, $284 billion. If you did not get a first PPP and you qualify for a PPP loan, you can go and still, now you can reapply for your first PPP. If you already got a PPP loan, now you can apply for a second PPP loan if you have less than 300 employees and can show a 30% reduction in revenue from a single quarter of 2019 to a corresponding quarter of 2020. So it has to be corresponding. It has to be either January through March of 19 through January through March of 20, or October through December of 19 through October of December. It does have to be a calendar quarter. You can't just pick 12 weeks and say that's my quarter. So that's a caveat. It's got to be one of the recognized 4 quarters. At least that's how we're reading the legislation now. 2.5 times your average monthly payroll expenses. So that's just the same as the last one, capped at $2 million. So nobody's allowed to get more than $2 million on this. And if you were not in operation for all of 2019, there's some different calculations that I'm not going to get into. They've expanded forgivable expenses. So in addition to all the things that the old PPP covered, like rent, utilities, your payroll, obviously you got to spend 60% of it on payroll 40% on other expenses like rent, utilities, etc. Now you can buy some other things with your PPP money. Software, cloud computing for things that you need for business, property damage that was caused by riots or vandalism in 2020. Obviously, there were some protests and some rioting, and they wanted to make sure that if your insurance didn't cover that, that you can use your PPP funds to repair any windows or any other damage caused by riots. Certain supplier costs can be covered, and you can also cover some capital investments, not just equipment, but also capital investments that you may have made for COVID-19. A good example of this is like businesses that added a drive-up window or made some other modifications, put up a sign in the parking lot so that there was a space for curbside delivery. But those types of investments, capital investments you can make, that's now forgivable. For nonprofits, this isn't really a thing, but it is kind of an overlying theme of this legislation is that PPP loans are not considered taxable income. So if you got a PPP loan, if you are a for-profit business, that loan, even if it's forgiven, it does not become part of your taxable income. And not counting CARES Act money is going to be a theme of how this bill addresses federal funding, is that it's not going to be counting in your taxes and it's not counting in other calculations we'll be talking about. Now, if you got a PPP loan or you're going to get a PPP loan for less than $150,000, things are going to be very much simpler for you in about a month. This bill requires the SBA to, in the next 24 days, create a form, a one-page form with some very basic information. Obviously, it'll have your name, rank, and serial number, and then it's going to ask you for the number of employees that you were able to keep because you had the PPP loan, estimate amount of how much of that PPP loan actually got spent on payroll, and the total loan value. And that's what the law says, right? So just a few simple questions. SBA is going to put together a simple form, and hopefully, I know a lot of us are waiting on that loan forgiveness. This is going to streamline that process and move those smaller loans right through the pipeline. Another great thing for the particularly small businesses, they set aside $25 billion in this act for PPP loans for those less than, with businesses that are smaller than 250, or for loans that are smaller than $250,000 and fewer than 10 employees. So that's going to really help out those small businesses to make sure that those larger companies don't come in and gobble up all of that $284 billion. But maybe you don't want to run out and get your second PPP loan, and here is why. I'm calling this the Save Our Stages grants, or we're all calling this the Save Our Stages grant because this is modeled on a piece of legislation that was introduced, I think, back in May by Klobuchar and Texas Senator Corin. I'm saying it wrong, but I know it starts with a C. Particularly to protect dance halls, and it has morphed into this very wonderful thing. And I believe it's actually called grants for shuttered venues is what it's labeled in this legislation. But I'm going to bounce through a few of the major questions, though the answers are considerably complex, and I'll move through this relatively quickly. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. But who's eligible? For-profits, nonprofits, as well as government entities as well that own live performance venues, whether they operate them or are promoters for them, performing arts organizations, so your symphonies, your ballet companies, your theaters, museums, that's going to be nonprofit museums. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Talent agents as well. We'll talk more about those guys, theatrical producers, and independent movie theaters. They have to have been in business before February 29th, 2020. So you can't just go into business last week and collect this money. This is going to be your gross earned revenue, right? So we're going to bounce a little back and forth between your earned revenue and your total gross revenue. But your earned revenue in any calendar quarter, if any calendar quarter was 25% less than its course in 2020 than its corresponding quarter in 2019. So, but again, it's got to be one of those 4 predefined calendar quarters. It can't just be 12 weeks you want, but you just have to show a 25% reduction, which is even easier to get into than the second round of PPP. And you have to either be currently operating or intending to operate in the future. So if you've closed your doors forever, you are not eligible to get this grant. Now, this is the tricky part, and this is almost going to sound silly because I feel silly saying it, but an eligible entity that receives a Save Our Stages grant may not receive a second PPP loan. That is what the law says. The law does not, however, specifically say that an entity that can receive a whether or not you can receive a PPP loan after you have, or whether or not you can get a Save Our Stages loan after you've gotten a second PPP loan. So we're kind of waiting for the SBA to come out with some guidance on that. But because what the law actually says, with the intent of the law, there's a conversation, and they're going to work out those details moving forward. So keeping an eye on that. What you cannot do as an eligible entity, you can't be publicly traded on the stock exchange, can't get more than 10% of your gross revenue from the federal government. I got a little bit of a few giggles, I think, last time I said this. You can't do porn. So you cannot do performances, services, or have merchandise of an excessive sexual nature. So you really got to, I don't think that they're going to be, if there's some brief nudity in a show that you're doing next season, that's not what we're looking for. It's the language is definitely in such that it's what you would consider, pornography at your performance venue. Also, you cannot have more than 2 of the following 3 characteristics. You cannot have venues in more than 1 country, venues in more than 10 states, or more than 500 full-time employees as of February 29th, 2020. So those are the cannots, and the cans get you the overriding eligibility. But let's talk a little bit more what each entity has to do. For those live performance venues, performing arts organizations, and producers, they've got to show that 70% of their earned revenue, right? That's their earned. So a nonprofit, this is not counting your donations or your grants. 70% of their earned revenue comes from tickets or admission charges, production fees or reimbursement for live events, concessions or merchandise at those events, or nonprofit educational activities, right? So that you have to have at least 70% of that revenue that you earn comes from that. You got to do some regular marketing, print or online. Has to be some kind of payment, a fee or admission. You have to pay staff and performers a fair wage. It says fairly paid. So if you're all volunteer, you can't just hand everybody $5 bill and say that you now have paid staff, right? It's got to be a fairly paid staff and performers. This is going to actually cut out some community theaters that may have professional staff and designers and directors, but have performers that are not paid. Still waiting for the SBA guidance to be sure. But that's an important part to make sure that we're dealing with professional theaters. You have to have clearly defined audience and performance areas. You got to have at least 2 of those 6 positions: sound engineer, stage manager, security, box office, booker, or promoter. At least 2, and 2 of those positions being done, and at least 1 person doing them, right? So it's a pretty low bar to clear. Also, you have to have mixing equipment, a public address system, and a lighting rig. You've got to have those 3 things. Let me see. Okay. Back up a little bit here. Looking at museums, they have to be nonprofit. So under this particular instance, and only museums have to be nonprofit. So you cannot just set up your bottle cap collection in your living room and charge admission, right? We have to have a nonprofit museum whose principal business it is to do indoor exhibition spaces, and that you were restricted from operating by the pandemic. And in that museum, you have to have a fixed audience seating for regular programming. That's a theater, a lecture hall, a performance type space, something there like a performance space that you regularly program. Talent reps, those agents have to get at least 70% of their business from representing professional artists for live performances, specifically the live performances that we just talked about on the last slide. Movie theaters, they've got to be a movie theater. There's got to be a seating area, a screen, a projection booth. They've got to advertise, and they've got to charge admission. A few notes on the calculations. Full-time employees have to work 30 plus hours a week to be counted as 1 FTE, 10 to 30 to be counted as a half FTE. None of the CARES Act funding counts towards your gross revenue when you're calculating things for this grant process. So if you got anything from the NEA that was a CARES Act grant, or something from the Arts Council, or something from your city, your local Arts Council, or any dollars that were granted to you, or your PPP, which was granted, loaned to you and forgiven, all of those, none of those CARES Act dollars count towards your gross revenue when you're doing these calculations. And there's also, you got to do accrual accounting, and there's going to be, SBA is going to come up with something for seasonal employers so that they can calculate things differently. Few things to note: not everybody is eligible at once. There's two different priority periods. They're going to gauge between April 1st, 2020 and December 1st, 2020, and how much less gross revenue, right? Total gross revenue did you have from those months, those 9 months in 2020? How much less was it than the same 9 months in 2019? Right? So that's gross revenue. That means your donations as well. So that obviously disadvantages a lot of nonprofits from getting into this first 14 days, but understanding that everybody that's getting that priority treatment is a business or entity that has lost 90% of their revenue as a result of COVID-19. So that's why they're getting the priority. The next 14 days, exact same situation, except instead of a 90% loss, it's a 70% loss. So you see we're opening it up a little bit. Still might not be a lot of nonprofits that might get 50% of their gross revenue from contributions. So we're going to have to wait 28 days for a sizable section of our community is nonprofit. Oh, sorry, I went a little too fast. After the first 28 days, they're going to start giving out the rest of the grants through the SBA, knowing that the SBA can only give out 80% of the 15 billion in that first 28 days, right? So there's a limit, which means there's going to be like at least $3.5 billion left at the end of this. It might only be a one-letter difference. It is a 3-0 difference. Of $3.5 billion is a lot of money. So try not to get too worried that it's all going to be gone as we move through this, because I think that that it may very well meet our need. Also, the SBA has to give at least 2 billion of these to entities with fewer than 50 full-time employees, right? So now that can be in the priority period or after the priority period, but at least 2 billion of that $15 billion needs to go to a smaller business with less than 50 employees. And nobody with, you can't have more than 5 affiliates of a single entity apply for a Save Our Stages grant. How much is the grant going to be? For most of us, it's going to be 45% of your gross earned revenue during 2019. Unless you're a really big organization, it gets capped at $10 million, right? So that's the amount. Those that didn't start their operations until after January 1st, 2019, they're going to do an average of your gross earned revenue for every month of your operation, and they're going to multiply that by the prorated amount of the number of months that you were open. There is a bonus grant, right? So let's figure we get through everybody gets approved. After you've been approved for your first grant, if you have in the first quarter of this year, right? So January 1 through March 31 of 2021. So sorry, this coming year, then, and you can show that you are still lost 70% of your total gross revenue. That's your total gross revenue. Then you can apply for a second supplemental grant that would be 50% of the initial grant that you received. And at no time, no matter what, can the combination of your Save Our Stages grants equal more than $10 million. What can you spend it on? Well, you got to get your initial grant spent by December 31st of 2021. If you get that additional grant, you've got till June 30th, 2022. If you can spend it on everything that you could spend a PPP on, payroll, equipment, rent, insurance, etc. Most mortgage payment and utilities, but you can also spend it on advertising, travel, capital expenditures, and things like that for the live performances that the federal government is hoping that you're about to do with this money. Prohibited expenses are, you can't buy real estate, right? You can't go out and buy money, and you can't actually spend it on mortgages for any real estate or anything that you bought after February 15th of 2020, right? So this is only for mortgages that were, so you can make your mortgage payments if you had purchased your property prior to February 15th of 2020. You cannot reloan it out to anybody else. You can't invest it in the stock market or in any other way, and you can't make political contributions. Also, you're really going to need to keep your records because there's going to be a lot of oversight. Obviously, this is a lot of money coming out of the SBA, so they're going to be watching it very closely to determine fraud, non-compliance, and misspent money. So you got to keep 4 years of your employment records moving forward and 3 years of all other records as part of the law. Few quick things to wrap up. I talked about the NEA money coming in at 5.2 faster. Also, for the last 2 fiscal years and fiscal year 21 that we're technically in right now, all the NEA grants can be for operating support. If you got a project award, it can be for operating support. So they're just kind of forgiving because you cannot plan a project in a pandemic. Got some great funding for both the IMLS and Corporation Public Broadcasting. 15 million new dollars for a museum grant program for American Latino museums. Really happy to see that. An extra $500,000 or 30.5 million for arts and education grants. 2 new Smithsonian museums got authorized to go on the mall, the National Museum of the American Latino, and this is a working title, the National Museum of Women's History. So really excited to see both of those. Also, so that was what's in the FY21 budget. This is what's in other federal funding, and this is actually a big deal for Texans because in North Carolina, we spent all our CARES Act money, but I understand that you guys have about $5 billion in your coronavirus relief fund from the CARES Act for the state, maybe some others in tribal and local. You got an extension for a year, right? So we were all rushing, the governments are rushing, how are we going to get this out the door by December 31st? Now you've got till December 31st of 2021. Also, we talked a little bit about that the charitable deduction. We're really excited to see that. Been always working for charitable deduction legislation. This next one, obviously, if you've been watching the news, you know it's a big that the president wants to see the stimulus checks go out at a much higher level, $2,000 for an individual, $4,000 for those filing jointly. Right now, it's just $600 per person for those making under $75,000 a year, or $150,000 per household filing jointly. You get $1,200, and then $600 for every dependent child. So we will see whether or not that starts showing up in bank accounts. And there's an additional $20 billion for the economic injury disaster loans. So I know that was a ton of information. You guys really probably don't want to buy my merch or come to my arts day in March 22nd through 24th. And so I will open it up for any questions, and maybe I will stop the screen share so I can see if there's anything in the chat box. And woo, how'd I do on time, Ann?
You did awesome. It was 4:36. You were out by our hose, absolutely. And I'm sitting here floored. Your knowledge is really, really helpful. And I know this is a lot of details, and there aren't any questions yet. I will say I know that the slides and having access to the slides to just digest this is going to take everybody's time, and we will continue to share those on Facebook. So I think I have a couple comments too. And again, thank you tremendously. A couple of big shout outs, and a big shout out to Senator John Cornyn, who along with Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota were the original co-sponsors in the Senate, and their leadership was paramount in helping pass this. Also in Texas, House Representative or Congressional Leader Roger Williams, District 25, who's actually my congressman, he was one of the co-sponsors in the House. So we've got some Texas representation there, and really want to know that there's more support, but that their leadership has been really important. Another thing is I want to give a shout out to the acronym, which you probably have heard, called NEVA, which Nate also mentioned, which is the National Independent Venue Association. And they are to be commended for really being born out of the pandemic. And they are a model arts advocacy, arts and music advocacy organization in terms of how they grew out of passion for the field of performing arts and the independent venues, the knowledge that industry was not being served, and of the economic impact and the connection between live music and for-profit, nonprofit, restaurants, hotels, bars, the whole economy, the very, very big economy that is interconnected and woven together. So a shout out to all of them. The other big question is that as of 4:38, as far as we know, unless it happened while we were just on the Zoom call, the president has still not signed this bill. And that begs the very large question that we don't have an answer to, but know there are discussions that the president had wanted to increase the individual amount of money at the $600 to, not the $600, the money going to families and individuals, wanting to just increase that, having other concerns that were not in both the spending bill and in the COVID relief. So there's a waiting game. It's related to veto periods and when the Senate and Congress is in session. So we're all on tenterhooks waiting to find out if this is actually going to be signed and implemented in the manner that we see. because this bill was voted on by Congress, you can't just change it up at the moment. You'd have to go back to the drawing board and really begin the process again. So I don't know, Nate, if you have any other insights in the last 39 minutes or thoughts on that.
You know what, I don't have any real insights. I think it was interesting because I actually have not seen the video that President Trump released via Twitter last night. I know it's 15 minutes and I've had a lot of other things going on today.
Right.
But in addition to calling, there's been a lot of coverage over the fact that he asked for those checks to be doubled. I think some of the things that he called out that he thought were wastes of money included the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the national, I think of the National Gallery as well, or the National Museum of Art. So oddly enough, he was talking about the relief bill, but those items weren't in the relief bill portion. Those items are in the budget. And I believe that those items not only are in the budget, but they were in the president's budget that he submitted. So so he's sort of, you know, coming out against his own budget. And to drive, I guess, a partisan divide, kind of back to the culture wars, and our favorite senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, and kind of bring up some of those arts as a scapegoat things. So I don't know whether or not that's going to go anywhere. Most of the coverage seems to be specifically on the checks, but I haven't heard any mention that there's a problem with the PPP loans, the unemployment, or the Save Our Stages grants.
So nor have I. It's a waiting game at this point to see that he signs that. So we will continue to keep you all apprised. Yeah, fingers crossed tightly. This is much needed. There is an anticipation that with the new administration in January 20th, that there will be more pandemic resources provided, relief provided. So we'll be continuing to advocate on behalf of that. Without further ado, I will draw this session to a close. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank Nate, and again, his giving a call out for our national network with Americans for the Arts called the State Arts Action Network, as he referenced. A really remarkable peer group. Almost every state and U.S. territory has an advocacy organization, and we really together learn from each other, share. This is a classic example of sharing our knowledge and supporting each other's work, knowing that as our individual states we have our own micro sort of ecology of our own art sector, but that we have many parallels and can benefit from working together as a national coalition. So thank you again, Nate. I wish everybody a happy, healthy, wear your mask, social distance Christmas, and also going into the new year. We will be here again next Wednesday on December 30th, I believe it is. And we'll be talking again about our Arts Advocacy Day, which is scheduled in January 26th, and also February 9th and 11th. It's a 3-day adventure to really learn more about speaking with our Texas legislators. And if you're not doing anything on March 22nd or 24th, you can also participate in North Carolina's Arts Day. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we will provide any feedback and comments also in the comment box. And keep advocating and continue to support our work. We really appreciate it. Thank you.